been there, right? That time that you were driving down the road and you made the decision to allow the passenger to play DJ. That's an iffy decision, right? It could go several different ways, right? But you were gracious and you let them start choosing music. And if you've ever had, like I've had moments where a song comes on from their playlist or the radio station that they chose, and my foot starts tapping. And I might start hitting my leg a little bit, bobbing my head. First time I've heard the song, but I like it. I mean, I love it. It makes me feel good. And I did what you probably did whenever you're in that kind of situation. You look to the passenger and you ask this question: who sings this? Why? Why do we ask that question? Why don't we ask, what's the name of this song? Well, why don't we ask, where did you get this album, or anything else? Well, I mean, what difference does it make if we know who sings the song or who wrote the song? Why do we always want that name? And I have a suspicion, at least from my experience. I want the name because if I know who sings this song, then I can figure out what else they sing. And if I can figure out what else they sing, I can start putting together some of their story, some of who they are. And I can learn about the meaning behind this song that's probably a little deeper than making my foot tap. And I can start learning about some of the motivation behind that song, what some of their life experience was that led them to put those words to those notes. I might even start to learn some of the magnitude or the impact that that song has had in the world, the charts that it's done and the money it's made and how much people love it and it means to them, right? All of a sudden, when you know the name of the singer or the writer, the song becomes more than a song. And you don't ever listen to it the same way. I'm going to give you an example. This song, the one that you're about to hear, you've probably heard a million times. But I bet you don't know who performs it. Take a listen. Feel free to tap your foot, slap your thigh. If there are any swing dancers, go ahead. You recognize it, right? You've probably heard this song a dozen times, either on the radio or seen it in a movie when people who really know how to dance to it. It's really entertaining and it's really incredible, but you have no idea who performed this song. I'm going to tell you, because the story behind the author is pretty amazing. This song's best known for being performed by Benny Goodman. And Benny Goodman is a 1930s jazz and swing. In fact, he was called the King of Swing. He's maybe the greatest clarinet player of all time, and he had a big band that was really, really famous and really, really popular. But here's what's interesting about Benny Goodman's band. It was the first and only fully integrated band, meaning he was the only white band director that had African-American musicians in his band. In fact, he was the first to be on television with a black piano player. On tour, the Benny Goodman band could not tour in the South because the Jim Crow laws would have put him in jail. He was a revolutionary. He was a leader. He was part of the civil rights movement before we even knew what a civil rights movement was. And here's my guess. It's not a guess. It's a foregone conclusion. The next time you hear Sing, 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 this song, you will think of Benny Goodman. And you will think of the difference that he's made, the change that he helped make in our world. He made the world a better place. You'll never listen to it the same because you know who made the song. This is why it's so important to know who the people are that wrote the parts of the Bible that you and I read every day. Because we know the parts, we've heard the parts, it's familiar to us, we can tap our foot to it and maybe even sing along. But we've never examined who put those words there in the first place, and my suspicion is the more we get to know them, the more incredible what they wrote becomes. Because like I said last week, there's no book of the Bible called Jesus. There's no book of the Bible called the Gospel According to God what you find is the gospel according to Matthew. Why Matthew? Why a human guy that got to write this? I don't know unless I start to examine who he is. And the reason Matthew is selected, the reason why any of the gospel writers are selected is because they are a witness. Now think about this for a minute. I get really excited about this. Matthew knew Jesus. He knew what Jesus smelled like. He knew what Jesus talked like. He knew what Jesus said and what Jesus did, not because he heard it from Peter or from Bartholomew or any of the other, because he was there. He was one of Jesus' 12 guys, the guys that walked around with him all day, every day, did everything with him and for him. Matthew knew Jesus. He saw what Jesus did with his own eyes. He heard what Jesus said with his own ears. He was there. And then, lucky us, he sat down and said, everybody needs to know this. He sits down and writes his account, his own experience. Not what he heard from everybody else, but what he had experienced, so that every generation after him would know that Jesus does things a little different. And when I read Matthew from start to finish, there's one theme for me that consistently shows up. And it's a theme that comes from Matthew's own life and his interactions with Jesus. And it's this idea. If you don't hear any other idea this morning, make sure you get this one. Your from now on depends on now, not from. Your from now on depends on now, not from. We don't say from on. We say from now, from this moment, from this spot on the timeline on is what we're going to focus on. And Jesus comes into Matthew's life and he says, regardless of where you are from, I got a new now for you, and we're going to walk on together. And he changes Matthew's life. And you've gotten to hear a couple stories this morning, and there were a few in the first service where Jesus had done the same thing, but Matthew's is so vivid. Matthew, he is living out the gospel. I mean, he is skin for the gospel. Because Matthew was not a good person. He says so himself. And in chapter 9, what we call chapter 9 at least of his gospel, he didn't, by the way, write chapter 1 in the beginning. It wasn't like that. He just wrote it down. We put chapters and verses in it so we could find it. But in what we call chapter 9 of his gospel, he writes his own encounter with Jesus. And this is what he says. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man named Matthew. Now, you know you're a big deal when you can write about yourself in the third person. But that's what he did. He saw a guy named Matthew sitting at his tax collector's booth. Let's talk about a tax collector for just a minute. And you know, you've heard this a dozen times if you've ever been to church, that tax collectors were not liked in the first century, especially by Jewish people. And here's why. You were a Jewish person collecting taxes for the Roman government that forcibly occupied your land and your people and is taking your money. Can you imagine? I mean, we all love tax season around here, I know. We get really excited, and we look forward to it. And can you imagine, though, for a minute, when you show up to pay your taxes, that you realize and understand fully that that money is not going to America, but it's going to a foreign power that beat us down and took us over. Let that sink in for just a minute. And then realize that the person taking the money and handing it over to the enemy is an American. We can't overstate how despised tax collectors were, working for the enemy, taking extra money than what they needed or were told to take. You see, for anybody that was a tax collector, that title was synonymous with something like traitor. You're a traitor. You turned your back on your own people. You went to work for the people that beat your own people. What is the matter with you? And in our day and age, we can't imagine something like this. We call it treason. And minimally, there's jail time for that, if not execution. We do not stand for people betraying our nation. And Matthew betrays his nation in front of his nation every day for everyone to see. Think about this. Now, at least me, I always thought of Matthew as going door to door, like time to pay your taxes. But the truth is, Matthew sat in a tax collector's booth, not unlike the toll booth on our highways. They weren't driving cars, though. People were walking or riding on camels and donkeys. And he is positioned on the main road from Damascus down through Jerusalem. Damascus is modern-day Syria, down through Jerusalem, through all of Israel, and into Egypt. This is the road. And where his booth is positioned is in a town called Capernaum, which is like the metropolis of the northern Israel area. Everybody and their brother and their sister and their little dog too went through this spot. So if you were on the other side of the Sea of Galilee in what's called the Decapolis, and you had got some merchandise that you were going to bring back and you were going to sell in Israel and make $1, you were going to pay several dollars just to get in. And if you were a farmer from outside the region and you were using the main road to get to the market, you were going to stop and you were going to pay taxes. You were going to pay money to a foreign government through your countrymen. And they were going to smile while they took your money. And like I said, they were going to pad it a little bit so that they could have some for themselves. Traitor. Extortionist, that's the other title, because again, they knew that what they had to pay to Rome, so I can add a few dollars to that and just put that in my pocket and nobody's the wiser, except everybody was the wiser. Everybody knew exactly what they were doing all of the time. And you get bothered when you go through the drive-thru and they don't give you the burger you ordered. You feel like they ripped you off. Can you imagine this scenario? And then for anybody remotely religious, not only were they traitors and extortionists, tax collectors were sinners. You want to know the main reason? Because everybody goes through their tax booth, Jew and Gentile. And if you came in contact with a Gentile, if you associated with a Gentile, a non-Jew, you were unclean. And if you were unclean, you were a sinner. They were totally despised. They were called names. They were spit at. Nobody wanted to associate with a tax collector. You know where you put tax collectors? You put them with the prostitutes and the murderers and the thieves. This is Matthew. And this is Jesus. Follow me and be my disciple, Jesus said to him. So Matthew got up and followed him. If Josh Petersen were one of the early followers of Jesus and I was present for this, I'd go, Jesus, if we just go a little further into town, there's better people. There's people who are not going to get rocks thrown at us. There are better choices, wiser choices. Him? The guy in the tax booth? You're trying to get something started here. You're trying to get people to follow you. You're trying to start a movement. And you're going to pick the one guy in all of Israel who no one can stand? Do you know what that's going to do for your reputation? You see, what my questions would have been all about was from. He's from the tax booth. And I believe Jesus would have looked at me and gone, listen, I don't deal in from. I deal in now, on. And you know this because how does he refer to Matthew? Not as a tax collector, but as a disciple. And it's personal. He doesn't say, come be a disciple. He doesn't say, come be one of the disciples. He says, be my disciple. In a moment, in like a light switch moment, Jesus rearranges his identity, gives him a whole new label. Tax collector, disciple. Now, disciple has all kinds of connotations and definitions too. For starters, to be a disciple, it means you're a pupil, a student. And I am married to someone whose mother is a teacher, and I know how this goes oftentimes. The behavior of the students and the grades of the students reflect on the teacher, right or wrong. Am I right, teachers? And people, parents and administration, we make judgments about what kind of teacher the teacher is because of who the kids are in their classroom. Personally, I think that's unfair, but it's just the reality of things. And so can you imagine when the teacher, Jesus, takes on a pupil, Matthew, who everyone hates, how that will reflect on the reputation of Jesus? Can you imagine the questions? Jesus, are you condoning his behavior? Are you saying it's okay, that it doesn't matter, that we should just throw all the rules out? The pupil is going to have all kinds of effect. Not only that, he says, be my follower. That's what being a disciple means. Go with me everywhere. Be associated with me. When people see me, they're going to see you. They're going to know we're together. Because here's what I would do. Like when I was a kid, I want to believe that I've matured. And maybe you did too, where you have a group of friends and the other group of friends, and you just got to make sure that those two groups of friends never see each other. Because you're kind of one way with them and another way with them, and as long as those paths don't cross and the worlds don't collide, you'll be good. And Jesus is like not doing that. It would have been easy to be like, Matthew, we can hang out, but if we get close to a synagogue, hang back. He's like, no, you be my follower. Everybody's going to know we're friends, which is the third connotation here. Disciple's a friend. Deeper than we're associates. Deeper than we have a teacher-student relationship. You're my friend. I care about you. You mean something to me. Can you imagine Matthew in his tax collector's booth, saliva running down the screen from him getting spit at, probably bruises from rocks being thrown at him, has the God of the universe knock on the window and say, I got something new for you. Crazy to think about. Crazy to sit long enough to get into Matthew's shoes and realize that Jesus came into his life and Jesus comes into your life, and he says, from now on, your future depends on now, not from. You can start again. You can get a new label, a new identity, a new relationship, a new association that changes you, that changes all of it. And Jesus says to Matthew, from now on, I'm not going to call you Matthew the tax collector, I'm going to call you Matthew the disciple. And you're going to go from the bottom of the barrel, the least of everybody that nobody wants to be around and nobody wants to see, and you get to write my biography. If ever you've been in a place where you go, Jesus doesn't want me, you haven't met Matthew. Because if Jesus will go all the way to the tax booth, he'll go wherever you're sitting to. Now, the problem in this story is that word got out. Jesus actually lived it. I mean, he let the worlds collide. And Matthew says, hey, Jesus, you got lunch plans? I'm having a party. I'd love for you to be there. This is what happens next. Later, Matthew invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests. Now, this is the part that cracks me up. Along with many tax collectors. Jesus goes from one tax collector, which would have been hard enough to navigate, to many of them. Matthew didn't go find his best friends that were the most put together and had the best reputation. He just gets the rest of them. And he goes, you're never going to believe it. This guy, He likes me. And everybody else goes, that can't be. Nobody likes us. Matthew says, well, come over. And then it says, and there were other disreputable sinners there. Like people knew. People knew. It wasn't like we sometimes do in church where we're like, yeah, we're all sinners and we all fall short of the glory of God, but I'm kind of put together. It's like, no. Everybody knows it's all hanging out there. Anybody at this party was not liked, not appreciated, not respected by anybody else in all of the land. And there who are sitting around the table with Jesus. And by the way, it's not like dinner was, we happen to be hungry at the same time, and there happens to be some food for everybody at the same place, and we all happen to be there. It wasn't accidental. Dinner was, I accept you. I'll have community with you. What this dinner signifies is Jesus accepting people based on now, him in the room, who they are through his eyes. Something that these people had never experienced before. And what's so crazy to me is Jesus doesn't stop and go, now, I'm willing to come to this dinner party, but make sure that they behave themselves when I'm there. There's certain language I don't want to hear. There's certain topics I don't want them to bring up. He just goes. All of their rugged, rough around the edges, and has dinner. And then the religious people show up. This is how that goes. But when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with such scum? That quick, the old labels brought back up. Scum. Like the stuff you scrape off the bottom of a boat. This is who these people are. Now, here's what's amazing to me. The Pharisees are not talking to Jesus. Did you catch that? They're talking to his disciples. And if you know anything about Jewish law, they're talking to Jesus' disciples outside of the house that Jesus is inside of. Because a good Jew, especially a Pharisee, would never go into the home of an unclean person, because if an unclean person lives there, and that's an unclean home, and if I go in there, their unclean is going to get on me. And if their unclean gets on me, then I'm in trouble, and I cannot have that, so I cannot get that close to them. Which just reminds me of like Christians in this day and age will say things like, I really love messy people until their messy touches me. And Jesus is like, no, I'll come in. And so they're standing outside criticizing Jesus for associating with who they've deemed scum, but who Jesus says, I've come to save. And what we see is the Pharisees rejecting Matthew now based on his from. They're not looking at the fact that Jesus has accepted him. They're not looking at the fact that this teacher, this miracle worker has invited this guy to be his friend, his disciple, his follower. All they're concerned about is the tax booth. And all his friends that came to the party too, they're from the tax booth too. And if you've ever been in a tax booth, you are scum. End of discussion. And some of us have felt this, right? Like we've done some things, we've been some places, we've made some decisions that we think forever label us scum. You just haven't met Matthew. Now, Jesus overhears what they're saying, and I don't know if he shouted it. I kind of wish he was still in the house. He's just yelling at them. My guess is he was more civil, and he went outside, and this is how he addresses them. When Jesus heard this, he said, healthy people, newsflash, don't need a doctor. Sick people do. Raise your hand if you've ever gone to the doctor just because you were feeling good. No, nobody? Right, because we intuitively understand this, right? If you're sick, you go to the doctor. If you're feeling good, you don't even know that there's a doctor. Right? And so Jesus says, listen, whatever you want to call them, they're sick, they're broken, they're lost. And if our goal is to get the sick, broken, and lost to be healthy, whole, and found, they're going to need somebody to enter into the sick, broken, and lostness to help them find their way out. You will have to literally engage with them. You can't stand on your high horse or sit on a high horse. I don't know if you stand on it or sit on it. You can't stay outside the house throwing grenades, telling them how wrong and horrible they are. You're going to have to get in there and have a relationship with them. And then Jesus does what Jesus always did so well. He starts talking to them on their terms. So these Pharisees would have memorized the Old Testament. And they would know what the prophets had to say in and out. And so what does Jesus do? He quotes a prophet, Hosea, in fact. And Hosea's story is worth researching. It is unreal. But this is what Hosea says God says for all of us today. I want you to show love. Not believe in love, not agree with love, show it. And this is what's crazy. I want you to show love, not offer sacrifices. I want you to know me more than I want burnt offerings. And if you know me, then you're going to love people. You are going to love sinners. You are going to love Matthew. And you will show them because I showed them. Jesus lives this out and changes Matthew's life forever. And who knows what came of the other tax collectors there and all these other disreputable sinners. And I'm just convicted of this lately. This is full honesty. I'm far more connected and engaged with reputable Christians these days. This is what we do, right? Christians are really good at finding other Christians, especially Christians that are known as really good Christians, because then we get associated with them and we get to be really good Christians. And we just keep clustering up and we build a wall around the cluster and we feel safe and secure from all alarms. And then we read about Jesus, who hung out with disreputable sinners, and the reputable religious people were so critical of him for it. And I ask this question all the time now. Would any Christian get mad at me for the people that I'm hanging out with anymore? Right now? No. But Jesus says this after he quotes Hosea. He says, "For I've come to call not those who think they're righteous, but those who know they're sinners." You know what I've found about broken people? People that have made big mistakes and done wrong. They know they have. It's people like me that think I'm real righteous that forget or ignore the fact that I'm not. Jesus says, I came for them, which is monumental. Have you ever thought about this? That Jesus is for you? Not like for you like medicine is for when you have a cold. Like we take medicine for the cold to make the cold go away. And sometimes we think of Jesus, and this is true, but we kind of box him into Jesus is for me in that he's my get out of hell free card. But Jesus is better than that, and he's deeper than that, and he shows up and he goes, I am for you. While you're still in the tax collector's booth and you got nothing figured out, you don't even know how upside down you are, I'm for you. Like I like you, I'm cheering you on. I want to be associated with you. Follow me. I got something for you. I'm for you. That's what John 3:16, and everybody in this room, whether you've been to church 100,000 times or never ever before, you know John 3:16. How does it go? For God so loved the world that he sent Jesus for the world. Jesus is for you. And if he's for you, then you can step out of whatever booth you find yourself locked in and find freedom. Because your from now on depends on now, not from. if Matthew's from now on depended on from, we wouldn't know who Matthew was. You know that? We'd have no idea about a man named Matthew from Israel. We might not even know what a tax collector was in that day, even though that was his from. But if Jesus was so hung up on him being scum, he would have moved on to somebody else. Except the crazy thing is, Jesus moves on from Matthew and he gets a guy like Peter. And then he goes and gets Thomas and Mark and Luke and all these guys you're going to read about where you're going to go, how did they get in the Bible? And then Matthew, as he sits down to write this account, infuses what he experienced from Jesus in everything that he writes. And this is the power of knowing who wrote what they wrote, because you start to see something special and unique. What's so crazy is that Matthew's biography of Jesus is just a little bit different from Mark's, and a little bit different from Luke, and a little bit different from John. Not in that they say different things, but the way they say it is different because they each had an experience. And so when you come across places like this in Matthew's gospel, where he writes, "Come to me," these are the words of Jesus. He made sure that these got in, and these are only in Matthew, said the way they're said here. "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." This is your from, this is your now. "Take my yoke upon you." And then as part of what we call the Great Commission, you've probably never noticed this before, but Matthew is very specific. It's not the same in Luke or Mark or John. He says this in what we call Matthew 28. Jesus said, "Go to the people of all nations." Every race, every ethnicity, every level of brokenness and sin, go to them and make them my disciples. Take them from their from and give them a whole new now. I love that Matthew comes full circle. Jesus calls him my disciple, and at the end, he makes sure that Jesus is recorded as saying, "Make them my disciple." In other words, Matthew, Christians, love them the way I've loved you. And Matthew, I showed up in your mess. I gave you a whole new trajectory in life. You make sure you love other people the same way. Don't forget. And then one other place, and I love this because it's Matthew talking about my boy. Well, it's Jesus talking about my boy. Matthew makes sure it's recorded. He says, now, I say to you that you are Peter. Because Peter used to be called Cephas. Jesus literally gives him a whole new name. "And upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it." You know what's crazy about the name Peter? You know what it means? Rock. Jesus says to the one who literally denied knowing him 3 times, who got like 9.9 out of 10 questions wrong on the test, and says, "I'm going to build a movement that's going to last millennia, and you're going to help lead it." And Matthew understood exactly what was happening. And here's what's cool. I haven't told you yet. The guy writing Matthew wasn't actually called Matthew for a lot of his life. He too had another name. It was Levi. And once he starts following Jesus and his life has turned upside down and changed forever, he starts referring to himself as Matthew. And do you know what Matthew means? Gift of Yahweh. Jesus takes Matthew from tax collector, meaning traitor, extortionist, sinner, turns him into a disciple, meaning pupil, follower, friend, and gives him a whole new name which goes from scourge of the earth to gift to the world. Because you will record the red letters that will change the world forever. Matthew, your from now on depends on now, not from. And so for you and me, to live like Matthew lived, to experience what Matthew experienced, to respond the way he did to Jesus, for you and I to do that, we're going to have to do just like Matthew. Luke records Matthew's interaction with Jesus as well, and the way Luke puts it is when Jesus says, "Be my disciple," Matthew leaves everything. Not a few things. It's not like Jesus said what he said, and then Matthew was like, "Let me get a few boxes of files to lug with us on this journey just in case I come back." It's like Matthew closed the booth, stuck the key in, locked it, and broke the key off. I'm not coming back. I'm leaving this. I'm leaving my reputation. I'm leaving my mistakes. I'm leaving the shame. I'm gone. I'm going with you. And for you and me, we have to leave it too. The problem is it's comfortable, right? That hat you've been wearing for so long, the reason you wear it is because it fits. And the reason that sometimes it feels like the tax booth of our life is calling to us is because it was comfortable. We knew it. It had definition. It gave us some meaning. It gave us a title. Whether we liked it or not, at least we had a place. But Jesus comes to you and says, if you want to from now on, you got to leave your from. You got to leave it. But there's another part to this. Not only did Matthew leave it, he had to believe it when Jesus gave him a new identity and a new call on life. That's the hardest part. You know what I find in conversations with Christians? If you're not a Christian, you're not going to be bothered by this. But most Christians I talk to, the thing they doubt the most is not, did God really make everything? It's not, was Jesus a historical figure? It's not, did Jesus actually die and did he actually come back to life? It's not, did Jesus do the miracles? It's not, does God really love me? Except that is exactly the one. Because we'll on the surface say God really loves me, but we doubt that he really likes us. We doubt that he really wants us. Most Christians and non-Christians struggle with that idea. Believing who Jesus says they are. Things like loved, forgiven, whole, blessed, belonging. This is my dare. It's a really simple, you can do this in 2 minutes today. Get on your computer and pull up Google. And in the search bar, just put my identity in Jesus Christ. And you are going to find millions of hits. And on all of those hits are going to be lists of passages from the scriptures that say who you are because of Jesus. And it's going to blow your mind. You didn't know you were all these things. But if you would spend just a few minutes this week believing it or trying to believe it, one, it's going to empower you to actually leave the booth that you've been trapped in, the identity that you've held on to for so long, that's beat you up so badly. And all of a sudden, you're going to start to experience some of what Matthew did, a whole new from now on. Because your now is something totally different than your from. And you might start singing what's become one of my favorite songs from one of my favorite movies, The Greatest Showman. Actually has a song in it called From Now On, and I think it could act as a prayer for you and I. It goes like this. From now on, these eyes will not be blinded by the lights. And sometimes for you and for me, that light is the shame of our past. It's the labels of our past. It's the wrong of our past. It blinds us from what Jesus is offering us right in front of us. From now on, what's waited till tomorrow starts tonight. Starts tonight, not waiting anymore. And let this promise in me start like an anthem from my heart. From now on. This is the gospel. This is Jesus. This is the story of Matthew who tells us the story. And he knows because he was there. Let's pray. Jesus, a lot of us are going to struggle all week long with this. We're going to struggle with believing that you see something in us at all, that you like us, that you really do love us. We're going to struggle with leaving behind the things that have defined us for so long. We're going to struggle. But I believe that Matthew did too. I believe it took time for Matthew to fully understand and to get used to his new label as your disciple. Will you help us, please? And for those of us that are walking with you and following you, God, will you help us to love people in our lives that are just like Matthew? The people in our society that we might label scum or less than. Lord, we want to be a community of people that are so like you and so walking in your footsteps that some religious people might get upset with who we associate ourselves with. Not because we like to cause controversy, but because we like to be like you. Lord, it feels like a tightrope. It feels like a really difficult thing to do, but we know we don't do it alone. So we trust that you'll go with us and help us along the way. Lord, help us to know who we are and whose we are in you. Amen.